Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of this event organised by the Islamic Society of Britain, which is looking at Malcolm X and the legacy of Malcolm X. My name is Mariam Ali. I was your host last week, and I have been a member of the ISB for 15 or so years. Last week, we had a kind of an introduction to Malcolm X and who he is by our wonderful speaker, Abdul-Rehman, who you'll hear from quite shortly. We kind of cantered through Malcolm X's life and looked at some highlights of his story. You know, we heard about his early start in his early childhood, when his father was brutally murdered by the KKK. We learned about his mother, a very strong Black woman who, under the extreme pressure of the system, was eventually institutionalized. You know, we went through Malcolm's story as a young man, his time in care homes and in orphanages, and we learned about the teacher who dissuaded him from higher education. Malcolm was a very bright young man, and he wanted to become a lawyer, but his teacher kind of told him to keep it very realistic for a Black boy and kind of stick to carpentry. And we saw that kind of led into a life and a youth of crime, where he found himself in kind of the underworld when he moved to live with his half sister Ella. We learned about his time in prison, where he discovered the Nation of Islam, and his time with the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm was a key figure in the movement of the Nation of Islam. The membership grew from 400 to 40,000 over a few years because of Malcolm X himself. And then we kind of saw the eventual kind of disillusionment with the Nation of Islam when he found out about the extramarital affairs that Elijah Muhammad, who almost had a prophethood-like status within the Nation of Islam. And we learned a lot. We learned quite a bit about Betty, the formidable Betty, who herself was a civil rights advocate and an agitator. And we learned very much that she wasn't just in the background, but she was there at the forefront. And we went on a bit of a journey with Malcolm in his time when he traveled to the Middle East and Africa, and eventually he made the Hajj, the pilgrimage, where he found kind of the traditional Sunni Orthodox Islam. And whenever I read Malcolm X's autobiography, I get very upset at the start, because you just know what the ending is, because we all know that Malcolm was assassinated, and it's quite depressing because he was going through kind of an ideological transformation, and he was becoming a bit more kind of positive in his outlook and optimistic, and having a sense of, yes, we can make a difference, yes, we can make a change, and we can do that together. So we finished last week with a promise that we would come back and use this session to look at the legacy of Malcolm and what we can learn from his life, and Abdul-Rehman, who is with us, will do that very soon. But before we do, I just wanted to really remind us that this is not a US issue, and this isn't kind of a white problem. Anti-Black racism is well and alive in the UK and in Britain, in the Muslim community, in the Muslim world. And as Muslims, we are not immune to that disease. We have the tools and we have the teachings, and we can see that from Malcolm's life, to eradicate it, but it's very kind of rampant and apparent in our communities ourselves. And I don't want us to get complacent and give ourselves a pat on the back and think, we're nothing like those Americans, we're not like the US, because like I said last week, George, this incident has just renewed the conversation about anti-Black racism and about Black lives. But we have our very own George Floyd's in the UK. I recently read about 3 cases in the UK. One was of Alessani Lewis, whose mother actually says that she can't watch the George Floyd video. I'm sure for many of us we can't watch it either, but for her it's so similar to the circumstances in which she lost her son. He was restrained by the police for 2 prolonged periods, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 minutes, and he eventually died because his brain was starved of oxygen. I read about Sean Rigg, who died under very similar circumstances. Police had applied pressure to his neck and his back for up to 7 minutes, and he died and lost consciousness and died thereafter. And again, he was in custody. And then we have Christopher Hull, who died in a police station. Christopher Alder, who died in a police station in Hull, who he choked to death, subhanAllah, while he was handcuffed, lying face down in a police station. So racism exists on British soil, and in many ways we have a longer way to go, because we've convinced ourselves that it's not a British problem, that, you know, we have kind of evolved. We're not like the Americans. You know, racism in the UK is felt by many, you know, anti-Black racism specifically is felt by many people, including myself. You know, racism is the street names in Liverpool. Liverpool was a hub for slave trading. The homes built, the wealth of that city, the street names, that is all as a result of the slave trade. You know, it's myself when I was in school, in a very Muslim school, I went to a Muslim school, you know, walking down towards school, and my friend suggesting to her mum, oh, why don't we give Mariam a lift to school? And her mum saying, oh, I don't want that black monkey in my car. You know, it's my friend being stopped whilst he was driving, and he had those air fresheners, those trees in his car, and he was stopped by the police, and the police officer actually said to him, I stopped you because I thought you were trying to hide the smell of weed. It was just that he hadn't taken down his air fresheners. You know, it's me again being followed in shops in the UK, and when I've traveled abroad. I remember a specific time in Italy when I was with another group of Muslim women, and I was the only person being followed around the shop as if I was, you know, going to steal something. It's present in our language. You know, in parts of the Arab-speaking world, Black people are referred to as abid, you know, which comes from the word abd, which means a slave. You know, and it's the lack of representation of Black Muslims in Britain and in the US. When we have these events and we have these panels, we don't have a lot of Black Muslim speakers. So I guess it's just a reminder that while Abdul-Rehman's going to talk about Malcolm X, who's, you know, kind of African American in the US, we have to remember that this exists in the UK, and it exists within the Muslim community, and we need to continue to have these dialogues to find a solution. You know, racism is a global disease, and there's very much a global solution to that. And as I said, we have the tools and the teachings, and we will learn from Malcolm X, you know, in his own experiences when he went to the Hajj, how he kind of came back, you know, he was on this kind of trajectory, this change, from kind of having this very extreme view of the white man as the devil to a sense of that there is a brotherhood and we can all kind of live together in equality. But it's about putting those teachings into practice. Inshallah, towards the end of this session, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to make a difference, but without much further ado, I'll pass it over to Abdul-Rehman, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the lessons that we can learn from Malcolm X. And for those who weren't with us last week, Abdul-Rehman is an educator, he's a journalist, he's a storyteller, he's an organizer, you know, he's a lecturer at the Yale University School of Divinity, and we're incredibly honored to have Abdul-Rehman with us. So Abdul-Rehman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Thank you, Mariam, not just for the introduction, actually, but more importantly for your opening remarks and for framing, I think, this conversation around the legacy of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, especially in the contemporary. Like I said last week, I think and I'm going to mention it again because I think it's important, not only because of the kind of extraordinary week we've had globally, as we see this incredible energy and mobilization of resilience and resistance to white supremacy through organized and violent racism, to systemic racism, that we really see emerging on every corner of the planet. It was so interesting to see gatherings in Ghana and Gambia and in Senegal, in South Africa and elsewhere, you know, giving support to those people who are asking for the obvious, for Black lives to matter in the United States and elsewhere. So there's a sense of global solidarity right now, which is actually quite telling because we're going to talk about that sense of internationalism that was at the very heart of Malcolm's mission, particularly in those last few years of his life. But the provisos or the kind of the initial points I think are important to make. One is that, you know, I my own positionality as a brown son of immigrants to Canada is not lost on me. And I think there is and has been a kind of a utilitarian approach that Muslims have taken to Malcolm and his life to make us feel better about our Islam or our Muslimness. That somehow we can hide behind Malcolm's lessons, example, life, his momentous Hajj, his moving into what we would term a kind of a Sunni orthodox position, even though those terms bother me. I think we often hide behind Malcolm. We turn him into a totem to celebrate the power of what Islam can do and about what being Muslim means in terms of the way in which we speak and act and think about race. And yet Malcolm obscures deep, as you described, Mariam, deep racism and anti-Black racism in particular in our communities. And I certainly don't want in any way to be someone who lends strength to the use of Malcolm as a mere totem behind which we hide our dirty laundry. So I think that's important for me to say. Connected to that is the ways in which Malcolm has been remembered and forgotten. For those years after his death, there was a concerted effort by the political authorities, by the FBI, by the police to reduce his importance, to see him merely as a rabble-rouser. And it was really through the work of artists, poets, writers, people like James Baldwin and the great Amiri Baraka, and the last poets that legacy remained alive. It was through primarily the work of Betty, who remained deeply committed to Malcolm, not only as her husband and her life partner, but as her co-creator in the work that he was engaged in. Malcolm would not have been able to travel and especially in those last 2 years of his life without the full support of Betty, and she supported it. She supported it deeply. So I think it's really important that we remember that we approach Malcolm now with a certain celebration and understanding his importance, but that wasn't always the case. And I think the third thing is, I apologize for any noise in the background. My son is warming up lunch. I think the other important thing, I think, for us to talk about and to place, at the center of the conversation is coming back to what you mentioned, Mariam, and that is the deep streams and threads of anti-Black racism within Muslim communities. And Mariam, we know it's there. It's been there a long time. I think I've been thinking a lot about the ways I witnessed it as a youngster in my own community in Toronto, which had an African-American imam, and the kind of things that would sometimes be said by particularly Arab and South Asian elders within the community. But actually, what is really, and I don't know if it surprised me, but it certainly has saddened me, Mariam, is that observing some of the social media conversation over the last week has been stunning. It's stunning to me that there is just such abject ignorance amongst really intelligent people about the issue of race. That somehow for us to declare solidarity with and to assert that Black Lives Matter is somehow a ticket into these oppression Olympics that Muslims all over the world love to play. As if our hearts and our sense of concern is so limited, is so is so narrow that we cannot find broad concern, and also not have the intelligence to see how anti-Black racism, modern forms of colonialism, modern forms of foreign intervention are all connected, that the modern economic systems which were built on the back of the slave trade, that the emergence of companies like the British and Dutch East India companies was built on the back of a kind of a hatred for Muslims and a racialization that took place afterwards. That we can't understand that the very wealth that is enjoyed by the lands which our parents came to is wealth that is built on the back of centuries of genocide subjugation, which involved a spiritual and religious justification for racism, that involved structures that had to maintain racism, that involved structures of power and violence to keep those who are not of the appropriate race in line. People are saying, well, race is a social construct. I've heard this a lot. I've heard this a lot from Muslims over the last week. I've been reading it, that race is a social construct. So I don't believe in the social construct. Well, try living in a Black body and tell me if you believe in that social construct or not. Or reflect on your own experiences of prejudice, a xenophobia, maybe even violence, and tell me if that's a social construct. When the system and the thug and the police comes after you because of the color of your skin and how they label you, then you can tell them it's a social construct. Or when the knee is on the neck of George Floyd, then you tell me it's a social construct. You think that would have helped? Oh, officer, it's a social construct. Why are you doing this to me? It behooves logic, and yet I have seen the most outrageous comments, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have robust conversations about this. These are difficult issues, and silence is also not an option. And sometimes I feel it's good that the racist or the prejudiced say what they need to say so we can get it all out in the open. I mean, part of it is like, okay, let's just get it all out, because the notion that we're somehow guarding our dirty laundry is ridiculous. And Malcolm understood that. When Malcolm confronted Elijah Muhammad about his extramarital relations, and he confronted the leadership of the Nation of Islam over what was happening, he was I'm sure he was told, why are you airing the dirty laundry? Why are you saying something for which there might be certain explanations? And yet Malcolm was very bold. We also have to remember, as some of our scholars have reminded us, particularly people like Sylvia Chan Malik, Dr. Donna Austin, both at Rutgers University, have noted, Malcolm X was Me Too before there was a Me Too movement. He believed the women who came to him. When the women came to him and said, Brother Malcolm, we need to tell you what's happened with us. We need to tell you that we've had children out of wedlock, that we've been sequestered away from the messenger. Did he say, no, I don't believe you? There must have been some reason for it. What did Malcolm do? He bought a ticket, got on a plane, went and saw them, sat with them, cried with them, held their babies, legitimized them, spoke to Betty about them. Malcolm believed the victim. Malcolm believed the victim first, and then confronted and investigated and found what the truth was, which is what these women were saying. So I think there has to be a measure of truth-telling in our communities around these issues and the difficult conversations. Now, of course, we want to have those difficult conversations. No one is suggesting having those difficult conversations outside the bounds of fraternity and community. But the strength of our community is shown whether or not we can have those conversations without those conversations developing into rancor. And by rancor, I don't mean hurt, because there will be hurt. These are hurtful conversations. These are painful conversations. These are traumatic conversations. We are discussing issues which affect our very sense of ourselves and our being in the world. And for some of us, those conversations may be life and death conversations. Right? They're not conversations coming from a position of privilege. They are conversations that are being had because they are life and death conversations. And so I think it's important for us to frame that. And I would encourage each and every one of us that we have an opportunity here. Those of us who are Muslims from non-African backgrounds, who may have faced other forms of prejudice, discrimination, but have not faced anti-Black racism ourselves, that this is an opportunity for us to engage and educate ourselves in a way that perhaps we haven't done so in our lives. To educate our children. How do we speak to our children about race? I'm often surprised. I think that in my home, my wife and I have modeled a welcoming, inclusive environment. And then I realize that we're not the only influences on my son's life, that he's out there in the world. And the world says and does things subtly and often and often directly, without any subtlety at all. And that things will be said, and I'll be like, whoa, where did that come from? And I realize that we haven't done a good enough job, because the job that we have to do as parents is that, in our home, part of it has been around centering Malcolm as a significant figure of love and fealty. That it's important for us in our house that a picture of Malcolm hangs in our house. That my son knows when he looks at that picture that that's Malcolm. It's a father to me. That was a saint. And then we make dua for him and Sister Betty, and we go and visit him and Sister Betty's grave, because he and she means something to us that's real. We need to try to model in our homes the way that we want our kids and ourselves to be out in the world. And I think that is a long process. And there's an education. There's a knowledge. People have been talking a lot about this past few weeks. And I'm going to jump into legacy in a moment, because I think people have been talking a lot about education. And I think in this moment, we have an opportunity not only to begin by revisiting the autobiography, but by reading about the freedom movement, by understanding through the lens of scholarship what anti-Black racism means, and from where does it emerge, and how it plays itself out. And I think if we want places to start, I would suggest, for me, there's sort of three texts that I would suggest right off the bat. The first is, in no particular order, Sylvia Chan Malik's book, Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam. It is a remarkable book. Even merely reading the introduction, one will find really your sense of what Muslimness means in the Muslim Atlantic and this diaspora changing. And she goes deep into the lives of Black American Muslim women in the 1920s. She looks at the ways in which inner city Black American Muslim women were emerging through movements like the Nation of Islam. She has an incredible chapter on Betty Shabazz. Sylvia is a race and ethnic studies professor at Rutgers, and please order the book. Being Muslim, you won't regret it, and it will change your life. It'll literally change the ways in which you will view the life of Malcolm and the way you understand race in terms of the history of Islam of Islam in the West. The second book, which I'm going to refer to a bit more in a few moments, is a book by Sohail Dolatzai called Black Star Crescent Moon, The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America. And really, the book is really about the legacy of Malcolm. What does global solidarity and a global vision look like in the aftermath of Malcolm X? And Sohail Dolatzai, who is a scholar of urban culture, Black culture, he's written extensively about film. He wrote a tafsir of NASA's Ilmatic with Michael Eric Dyson called Born to Use Mics. And recently is the editor of a collection of social justice essays called With Stones in Our Hands. Sohail is also the convener of an incredible exhibition, which we tried to bring to the UK a few years ago, called The Return of the Mecca, The Art of Islam and Hip Hop, an incredible exhibition of primary source material connecting urban culture, urban music, the emergence of hip hop directly with Malcolm, American Islam, African American Islam, the movements associated with African American Islam, from movements that we would call Sunni Orthodox to the Five Percenters and so on. Incredible work. So Sohail Dolatzai's work. And then the third work that I'll mention is called Muslim Cool by Suad Abdul Khabir. Again, a sort of a cultural history of African American Islam, looking at the emergence of this thing called Muslim Cool and its deep connection with African American, the African American experience. When Malcolm died in February 1965, on the 21st of February 1965, he died at a rally of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. In fact, it was the day that he was going to read the manifesto of this new organization. And I think what's really important for us to remember is that when Malcolm returned from the Hajj and returned from Africa, and of course he would travel again after that. He traveled to the UK, as we learned last week. In the few weeks before his death, traveled to Canada a few weeks before his martyrdom. Is that Malcolm is coming back to the United States, not thinking about the liberation of African American peoples as being a civil rights issue, but a human rights issue. He wants to present the case of the African American people to the United Nations, so that this internationalizes the struggle for Black liberation. And he ties that struggle for Black liberation directly into the decolonial struggles that are happening in Africa and beyond. That Malcolm is deeply entwined and tied to, cognizant of, connected to the struggles for Black liberation in Africa, the struggle to become independent of colonial rule and control. And so when he establishes the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he is establishing an organization which is mirroring the emergent Organization of African Unity. He's seeing Africa as leading the way in providing the basis and the foundation for unity amongst oppressed Black people in America. And by making the link of language between the Organization of African Unity and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he is creating this link across that Black Atlantic. What he's saying is that the struggles in Africa are not separate. This he learned from his father, who was a Garveyite. He learned early, it's in his DNA. This is in Malcolm's DNA, that he understood at a very young age that one could not be separate from the world or the history. When the Honorable Elijah Muhammad taught him about knowledge of self, immediately that knowledge of self is a discovery of who you are. Why is he Malcolm X? He is Malcolm X because the X represents the name that was lost in the Middle Passage, that legacy, lineage, genealogy that was lost. And that he called himself X because it was a reminder to all, especially white people, that what was taken from him was not merely his dignity and his life, but it was his lineage. It was his connection to his ancestors. And the X, what does the X do? What do? You solve for X, don't you? That's the mathematical terminology, and mathematics was very important in the language and in the spiritual structures of the nation of Islam. And so the X represents that which you must solve for. And therefore, the X is a reminder of the struggle to understand that knowledge of self and where you came from. So that Malcolm dies on the day that he's going to read the manifesto of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And he believes that it is in this global connection. When Malcolm goes to Africa, and there's been a lot written about this, Manning Marable's somewhat controversial biography of Malcolm gives us a very deep insight into what was happening in Africa. He's spending time with people like, he's meeting the family of W.E.B. Du Bois. He's seeing people like Maya Angelou, with whom he became very good friends. She, in fact, is coming back to the United States to join the Organization of Afro-American Unity when Malcolm is martyred. Malcolm is engaging with the Sufi tariqas of West Africa. Some people say he had direct connection with the Tijaniya. In Egypt, he's talking to the Al-Azhar. In the Arabian Peninsula, he's talking to the religious authorities in Saudi Arabia. Malcolm is very intelligently building a network in Africa. And so much so that, as Marable and others have told us, Malcolm is actually sending and facilitating students to go from the United States to study at the Al-Azhar. He's going to send students to study in the institutions of knowledge in the Arabian Peninsula. That part of what Malcolm is doing through the OAAU and through the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which is the religious institution that he is creating, which today is the Mosque of the Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem, that what Malcolm is doing is actually planting the seeds. Isn't it interesting? Look at the vision, which is consistent with the emerging vision of Black consciousness in the United States. This is about knowledge. It's about creating scholarship. It's about creating and facilitating and building leadership. And that's what Malcolm is interested in. He's interested in how is that possible. He's interested very clearly in making the political connections. One of some of the most amazing photographs of Malcolm is Malcolm sitting at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem with Fidel Castro, with Abdul-Rehman Bello, with the leaders of liberation movements and anti-imperialist movements, anti-colonial movements, and he's meeting them. He's sitting with them. He's learning from them. He's talking to them. One of the most interesting things that, there's a really interesting book called From the Dead Level. It's out of print now. I had a copy of it in London, and I recently was able to locate a copy of it. From the Dead Level. It's by one of Malcolm's nephews, who spent a lot of time with him in that last year as Malcolm was traveling around the United States. And in the Dead Level, we see a Malcolm Malcolm was a very good listener. I think it's important to remember. Malcolm was a good talker. He was a good communicator, master communicator. He was a master of rhetoric. Malcolm could make complicated ideas easy. And yet Malcolm was also a very, very good listener. He was a very introspective and thoughtful individual. And Sister Betty was a very introspective and thoughtful individual. There's a wonderful picture of Malcolm and Betty sitting at a lunch counter, probably in Harlem, listening to people who are members of the community or coming to them. And in the pictures that I've seen of that beautiful picture, is that we're seeing it from the position of where people are sitting and looking at Betty and Malcolm. And it's such a lovely picture because they're so intent. There's this they don't know the cameras there. They're so intently listening. Malcolm loved having coffee. He had to be on time, though. And the only thing he liked integrated, as he once famously said, was his coffee, maybe. but he loved coffee. It was his fuel. And he would sit at these lunch counters that were owned by the nation, that were owned by Muslims. And they would go, and that's where he would meet. When he did the one-on-ones, he would do the one-on-ones over coffee in the cafe, share a cup of coffee. Malcolm wasn't a big eater. He enjoyed food. He wasn't a big eater. But, you know, to sit with a cup of coffee with someone, to look at them, to listen to them, to offer them help and support. This was Malcolm's way. And so there's something about Malcolm that is learning constantly, that is learning constantly, that is unafraid to adapt and to change and to be different, to think differently, to look at past traditions and not fetishize them, to look at past certainties and question them. Yeah. And throughout all of this, there is a kind of an emerging, deepening connection and relationship to God that I'm really struck by with Malcolm. There's a constant in Malcolm's life that when the divine comes into Malcolm's vision, the divine never leaves. But his struggle to understand the divine, it continues. And remember, Malcolm isn't in himself and in the women and men who were his legacy. He didn't believe that you need to take their religion out of things, but he was smart. He knew that we needed to create spaces that would not preference a particular religious perspective. We bring that into the Organization of Afro-American Unity. We bring that space in. We bring all of ourselves in. But Malcolm was very careful not to impose. His approach was, let our Islam, let my development as a Muslim be borne witness to by my actions in the world. Don't look at what I say, look at what I do. But we listen to what Malcolm said and we see what he did. But Malcolm is telling us very clearly, that his approach to da'wah is not proselytization. It's inculcation. It's being. You be who you are. Be guided by the moral, spiritual frameworks, foundations that you hold to be true. He believed that in Islam, there is no doubt, he believed that in Islam, there was the spiritual medicine for the toxin of racism. Brothers and sisters, if we see racism in our own community, know that our Islam is incomplete. You know, I often think when Muslims say, I'm going to digress here for just one moment, Mariam. I often think that when Muslims talk about, you know, the lack of or you know, our challenges they have this week, whether we are a racist ummah or not, this is what I have to say. In his last sermon, Al-Habib Al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wasallam, didn't he warn us about three things? He warned us about three things. He reminded us to be careful when it came to the issue of women. He reminded us that the white did not have superiority over the black and vice versa, and the Arab over the non-Arab and vice versa. And then what was the third thing? He talked about charity and money and wealth. So I'm going to update the language a little bit to not have the perfection of the prophetic language, but have the vernacular of our own language. Gender, race, economic, and class justice. The Rasul ﷺ spoke about it. And why would he speak about it in his last testament to his entire community on his last Hajj in the last year of his life? Why would he say it if it wasn't important? You think the Prophet ﷺ would have said it if he'd reached perfection at his own time? Why do you need to remind something of people when they've already perfected themselves? The Rasul ﷺ in his wisdom understood that when it came to gender and to race and to class and economic justice, these would be the perennial toxins and evils of the human condition. He knew it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He knew it, and he told us about it. And the power of the prophetic wisdom is that it is evergreen, isn't it? My dear and beloved friend, brother, comrade, Chaplain Omar Bajwa, in his sermons and his teaching always reminds us of this, that the words of the prophet are evergreen. They're ever alive. We are not reading them in ossified form. And when he reminds us of that, I appreciate it, because we stop seeing the tradition as something being ossified, that we need to fetishize, that we need to totemize, but rather something that's living. Why would the prophet remind us about gender and race and class if these weren't going to be perennial issues about the toxicity of the human condition? These come from the satanic arrogance of the drama of our creation, described by God himself in Al-Baqarah. So what Malcolm starts to address is he is connecting to an Islam that is evergreen and ever present and ever alive, and that requires activation. So Malcolm wanted the Muslim Mosque Incorporated to be a site of spiritual activation, so that you could go into the Organization of African American Unity, you could go into the freedom movement, that you could go into the front lines and be spiritually vital, to be spiritually alive. My dear brother and friend, Dr. Rasul Miller, who's been with us here at Yale this year and is inshallah beginning a tenure track professorship at University of California, Irvine in the fall. Dr. Rasul's research has been around sort of African-American Sunni Muslim communities, and particularly his latest research has been looking at the aftermath of Malcolm. And in a very important lecture he delivered to us in conversations that we've continued to have, Rasul really centers the legacy, and maybe we'll end on this, Mariam, that we can open it up for questions, that Rasul really centers the legacy of Malcolm in a few specific ways. One is that Malcolm's vision and life and approach becomes the template for radical action within African American communities, particularly the emergence of the Black Panther Party for liberation becomes a sign of the ways in which Malcolm's radical message is being enacted. And so Malcolm's call to self-defense, Malcolm's call to building community institutions, Malcolm's call to building economic resilience is taken up by the Black Panther Party in a political way. So with the Black Panther Party, you have the Black Panther Party for self-defense and liberation. You have the emergence of the school breakfast program, like we talked about last week. We have the emergence of after-school programs in inner-city communities. We have self-defense and protection from racist, violent police. You have a call for all power to all the people, and that the call of the Black Panther Party is not merely the liberation, or not only the liberation of African Americans, of Black Americans, but it is global liberation from the structures of white supremacy, colonialism, oppression. And this directly is fed through the legacy of Malcolm. The second and third, and these are organizations that Dr. Rasul Miller reminds us are less studied, but are as important. The Black Revolutionary Army, which in many ways is led and facilitated by Muslims who believe that they need to raise the consciousness of people in their own communities and need to be ready to move the community radically forward and away from structures of white supremacy and power. The Revolutionary Action Movement, similarly, a movement of activists and intellectuals, of scholars, of poets, of artists who come together, once again, deeply, deeply informed by their Islam, to basically see what is required. And when we talk about radical action, what we are talking about is nothing short of the dismantlings of the systems of white supremacy and power. And that is the call. If that makes us feel uncomfortable, thank you, it should. I know that in my privilege, how much I benefit from that. And I know how much the work that I need to continue to do to align my heart and my mind to the great aspiration, which is to see the systems of taghut and oppression to be dismantled. And for us to have the vision to propose and to work with and to stand alongside our fraternal family and humanity to find a better way. And there is not only the need, it is necessary for our Islam to be at that table. The other final thing I'll mention, Mariam, is that in terms of ways in which we see the legacy of Malcolm, not only being observed, but being really built upon is through the founding of the Black Arts Movement, founded by Amiri Baraka and others. Leroy Jones was his name before he became Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka and the Black Arts Movement was a remarkable movement, which saw once again the centering of Black voices, narrative storytellings, artistic forms, and that art was to be done unambiguously away from the white gaze, on our own terms, to our own selves, celebrating who we are, challenging who we are. And so the Black Arts Movement actually develops as an entire ecosystem of artistic and cultural production, from visual art to music to poetry to literature to performance to dance to writing to photography. Recently at the Tate 2 years ago, we had the incredible exhibition of African of Black art, after the time of Malcolm, and really you see Malcolm's image, words embedded deeply into the entire tradition of Black art after 1965. And so the emergence of people like the Last Poets, of the popularity of people like Gil Scott-Heron and others, all this is an incredible output that takes place. And if you look at the works of people like Sonia Sanchez, of Toni Morrison, of Maya Angelou, they go right back to the tradition of Betty and Malcolm. That's where they feed from. Maya Angelou was close friends with Malcolm. As a young person, she spent time with Malcolm in Africa, deeply influenced by him, had dedicated herself to the work that he was dedicated to. This is important. This is important lineages. This is important genealogy for us to understand. And where does that leave us today? I would say that where it leaves us today is for us to engage fully with Malcolm's legacy, the easy parts of it and the difficult parts of it, for Betty's legacy, but to not see them as totems. Yes, to me, Malcolm will always be the great American saint. I believe him and his Betty were blessed, that their place of rest is blessed, that their memory is blessed. But the greatest blessing that can come from it is the transformation of us, that how do we take the blessing of their lives? We go out and do the work in the world. We do the work on ourselves, and we do the work in the world alongside those who are leading us in that work. And we guide it in humility as we have humility towards Malcolm and are guided by his advice, even though he's not with us physically, because we know the martyrs are alive in their graves. That do we have the humility to take direction and to work with our leadership, our African, British, and African American leadership? I think that's important. And it's important that we create those kind of safe spaces for deep and meaningful conversation. Inshallah, I'll mention the books again, Mariam. I'm just having a look at the questions.
Yeah, I've just seen the 3 questions. Actually, I wanted to, I know we haven't got that long. We've probably got about 3-4 minutes left. So
let's take 6.
But I wanted to
6 according to my watch. And I'm happy to stay longer if folks out there would like to stay longer.
Yeah. So I wanted to, you mentioned kind of the importance of us walking alongside those communities, and just the question, I think, and the concept of allyship. And I remembered when you said, you know, Betty and Malcolm would sit and they would have people come to them and speak to them. I remember the very famous story of the young white American woman who came to Malcolm and offered help. And I think Hajj Malcolm said that he didn't want or need the help from the likes of her. And I think towards the end of his life, he said that that was one of the things that he kind of regrets the most. And the reason why I'm thinking of this is because we have a question here from Omar. Sorry, I'm trying to bring it up here.
Yes, yes.
And I guess it's a question of, how much kind of patience should we have? So Omar asks, given the existing anti-Black racism in so many Muslim organizations and the tone deafness of leaders, how much patience should we have, and should we give up on these people, or should we be walking away from these organizational leaders? And I think, obviously that we can learn a lot from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, but I know as well that there's the example in Malcolm's own story around how the kind of transformation that he had in terms of thinking of people as allies and having that patience with them. So I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about that, and then we can always post the links for the books for the two sisters who've asked.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I'll be happy to that and other resources. Thank you, Omar Pai, for the challenging question. And this, by the way, is Omar Bajwa, our chaplain here at Yale University, a scholar and a leader in his own right, and my imam here in New Haven. Omar asked a really important question, and it's something that I really struggle with myself. I think I myself would admit that at times I've had a kind of a shortness of temperament and temper, perhaps, with existing Muslim organizations. I think right now I think right now is a clarifying moment. If you're tone deaf and you don't get this, man, like, you just don't get it. And if you are at least trying, I think there's something there. I think, it's true, that the Prophet ﷺ gave us a model of sticking with people. He's stuck with hypocrites, And I think there's something about that. I think there's something about, enlightened religious leadership, people like Omar and so many other women and men who are engaged in the work of pastoral care, chaplaincy, community leadership. Sukra, my dear friend and imama and chaplain, is on this call as well. She knows this from her own work, is that, part of the difficulty of being in leadership is not to give up on people and to maintain empathy. Now, the question is this: can we maintain empathy without a false sense of patience? We can be patient and hope people get to where we're going. That having been said, do we wait around and not move forward, creating the program, spaces, organizations, organized work, networks that are needed to deal with situations as they happen? And I think in a way it's both, isn't it? I think we need to have the bravery to be outliers and to go out into the world and to create new spaces or conceive new spaces, to join in friendship, and at the same time recognize that that great investment has been put into organizations that are far from perfect. Now, I think if those organizations are engaged in spiritual abuse, if those organizations are engaged in financial abuse, if those organizations are engaged in naked xenophobia and racism, then we dump them. There's no need for them. If there are as many organizations and institutions within our community are confused, then we need to call out with humility, but with directness of what is wrong. And that we're not throwing our fellow Muslims under the bus, but we are lifting ourselves collectively out of the morass, right? Out of this situation that we found ourselves in. But I will say this, and this is something that here, and in terms of the program that we're running here at Yale, the Muslim Leadership Lab, that we have emphasized, that this is not like a fard kifaya moment, This is like a fard ayn moment. If the Prophet wanted us to be shepherds, then we must equip ourselves to become shepherds. If the Prophet is calling each and every one of us to exert our service and our leadership, then boy, we better be ready for it. And no organization or community, organ or religious leader can be an excuse to standing in our way to get to that point. What would our community look like, Mariam, if we had a community of people who could be both Musa and Harun in archetypal ways? What would that look like? The ability to take a step back and to serve with heart, to be able to step forward and to lead with compassion and mercy, to speak in a way that is righteous and direct. You know what's interesting about the Quran when Musa speaks clearly and with honor to the Pharaoh? This is the amazing thing about oppressors. Even when you speak with honor and dignity, it is never received with honor and dignity. That's the nature of Taghut. The Pharaoh will always hear a challenge to his pharaonic rule, whether you say, Ya Pharaoh, or dear sir, or let me remind you. So the call on us is to say the righteous thing, yes, but know that the oppressor's reaction is not an indication of how righteously we have said that thing. That we, of course, maintain honor, dignity, humility, directness, love for the essential part of each and every person's humanity. And this is something that our contemporary African-American writer, who actually I read as constantly as I read Malcolm these days, and he's actually buried just about 50 or 60 meters from Malcolm, James Baldwin. You know, this is what James Baldwin, the great writer, the great commentator, essayist, novelist, human being, this is what Baldwin talked about. He talked about love all the time. He says, how can we be in society where there's no love? He said, this is all about love and our capacity to love. And you know what the pharaonic tendency does? The pharaonic tendency undermines our love. But I also want to remind myself of something that one of the great leaders of the South African anti-apartheid movement said. He said, you know, when you defeat the Pharaoh and you cross to the other side of the Nile, don't forget about the Pharaoh on the other side. And who is the Pharaoh on the other side? It's the Pharaoh that we carry in us. It's the Pharaoh I carry in my heart. It's the satanic disease which accompanies me and accompanies every human being. There's a Pharaoh on the other side. We can defeat the Taghut and the oppressor, but what about the Pharaoh in my heart? Have I subdued the Pharaoh in my heart? Have I drowned the Pharaoh in my heart? Have I spoken directly to the Pharaoh in my heart? Have I spoken to the way in which I oppress? I treat badly, I speak badly, I make assumptions, I act without humility, I act with arrogance, I am better, or do I consider myself better? What about the Pharaoh who is sitting on top of that part of our heart which is connected to God? If the ruh is min amri Rabbi, from the command of your Lord, then each and every one of us have something in our heart that is absolutely pure, isn't it? Absolutely pure and unblemished. But it's covered. Is the Pharaoh sitting on that part of our heart, covering it with his arrogance? And so I think that the call to us is not a call for this moment only of Black Lives Matter, is not only a call of this time of uprising. Boy, it is a lifelong thing. It is a lifelong thing, and you know, do I agree that Islam would be the start of the end of racism? I think Islam is a wisdom tradition. It comes from Allah, like all wisdom traditions do, that we have a way in which we can speak about these issues that is gratifying and that is human. And that is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created wisdom in so many forms. My call to myself and to all of us is to be the Muslims that we ought to be. And to be the people, human beings that we ought to be. And we should be those who are constantly striving and questioning and doing muraqabah and taking account. And it's one of the really interesting things about Malcolm, you know, and you read in the autobiography and the other literature, Malcolm is sitting with himself all the time, did I do the right thing?
Yep.
Do I need to make amends for something?
Yep.
Is there things that I can do better? You know, here's an example of a human being who lived in so many ways what he said.
There's actually one final question which I think ties in quite nicely to this next section of how we can better support the Muslim community, the Black community, and how we can be good allies. It's from, sorry, I've just lost it now. There it is, from Shaila. What is the best way to deal with injustice? For example, if you're followed around the store, should we confront it or let it go? So I think, you know, just from my own personal experience, I think in order to kind of bring about change, you have to be willing to make people uncomfortable. And I think, you know, if you safely can, then I definitely would recommend challenging somebody and asking them, you know, why is it that you're following me? Or if you're having a conversation and somebody says something that is problematic, then I think, you know, challenging that a little bit and asking them, what do you mean by that? And just keep pushing them until they get to a point where they realize actually what they've said, you know, there was a problem with that. But before we finish, and Abdul-Rehman, please feel free to add your own thoughts. Khalid, if you can bring up the list again. I have it here actually. So in terms of the top tips that we have, and these obviously are not exhaustive, you know, I think the number one thing is just self-education. It's not really for anybody, especially the communities who are going through this, to expend any real energy in trying to explain to people what the problem is. I think the top one is self-education, so kind of going out, reading, learning, and researching yourself. And then I think, you know, think practically what can you do in the spaces that you exist in, if that's your family or kind of your workplace. So looking at maybe organizing a meeting or an event at work to discuss racism, specifically anti-Black racism, and trying to educate those around you. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not children should be exposed to racism. And I think, you know, if we're not educating our children about race and racism, these are things that exist. They are there, and any kind of silence doesn't bring about change and doesn't improve anybody's lives, particularly those who are suffering. It just maintains those norms and those structures. So there are a number of books out there that can that are age appropriate, that can teach children about race and racism. We have a very own branch in the UK, the Black Lives Matter UK Fund. We can try and send out the link, inshallah, but a quick Google and you should be able to find it. And of course, you know, these people are organising and are committed to dismantling some of the systems here on British soil that disproportionately affect Black people. So please do donate there. And these are just books that I would recommend that I've read recently that look at race and racism and anti-Black racism in the UK. So we have British by Athol Hirsch. We have Natives by Akala, and he goes through what his experiences of anti-Black racism look like. And it's quite depressing, actually, because Akala's lived decades, you know, was born decades after Malcolm X, but he had a very similar experience at school where his teacher dissuaded him essentially from pursuing higher education because he was a young Black boy. And then there's the Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renier de Lodge. Again, another good read. All are quite easy reads, so really helpful. And then I think something to just get everyone thinking, there's a TikTok challenge at the moment, which you can Google, and I would recommend sharing it with people, which is about kind of checking your own privilege, and it goes through a list of experiences. You know, it asks people to put their 10 fingers up and then put one down for each time they've experienced something. You know, whether they've been called a racial slur, whether they've been followed in a shop, whether, you know, somebody has crossed the road because they're afraid of them. So I think that's an interesting, a useful, I think, exercise to take. Abdul-Rehman, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I know you've been posting the links for the books that you've recommended there.
Yeah, there's some really good, there's some really interesting resources, and in fact, if you'll give me just one moment in the chat. I don't know if it's possible. No, it's not possible right now. I was gonna. There was a statement that we put out through the Yale Muslim Life program that had a really good list of resources. I'll say that if you search for the Black Islam syllabus online, I think you will find an incredible list of resources there that have been put together by Dr. Wheeler, and they're really, really comprehensive. There's a lot of really important things going out right now. And I was also check out the site of Muslim ARC, Muslim Anti-Racism Collective here in the United States. They have a sacred pledge that they're asking folks to commit themselves to. It's really beautifully written, and also I think deeply empowering that we take a step with ourselves and our families to do the work. So please do check out Muslim ARC, Muslim Anti-Racism Collective. And finally, I'll say that ISLA LA, which is the inner city large African-American community in LA, which has been leading in the United States a lot of the national coordination around the Day of Outrage, which took place on Friday. They have an incredible list of not only resources, but they've been doing some really powerful programming that's been really meaningful. I've been finding a great deal of benefit from it. So those are three also things for us to check out.
Amazing. Jazakallah khair. Okay. I think it is now past almost 5:15, which is a testament. I think the fact that everyone's still here is a testament to how much they've enjoyed this session. I just want to thank Abdul-Rehman for taking the time to join us. It's been wonderful to have you speak with us for the last 2 weekends, and just kind of bringing Malcolm's life to life for us, and kind of kind of bringing his lessons to life for us. And I can't thank you enough. Jazakallah khairan.
Well, yeah, it's a pleasure.
And I want to just thank everybody else who's joined us. Thank you for tuning in. Please feel free to reach out to us if there's anything if there's anything more that you need, especially on this matter. I'm sure we'd be more than happy to share some extra resources. And I would just like to close with Surah Al-Asr. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.